You don't stumble into certain understandings. You're dragged into them, usually after something hurts more than it should. You already know this, even if you've never said it out loud. There are moments in your life where explanations fail, where optimism feels insulting, where advice sounds like noise. What stays is the bruise, and the bruise teaches. This isn't a story about growth or healing. It's about recognition, about why some truths refuse to arrive gently, about how pain becomes the only language the mind can't ignore. If you've ever wondered why clarity came after the damage, why insight followed loss instead of preventing it, you're already circling the point. This video unfolds in connected parts. Each layer depends on the last. Skipping ahead will feel easier, but it will fracture the understanding. Stay with it. Most people believe they understand others because they observe behavior. They listen to words, they watch actions, they count patterns. This creates the comforting illusion of clarity. You think you know who is honest, who is kind, who is dangerous, who is weak. But what you're actually reading is a performance layer, one that exists precisely to be readable. Human beings don't move through the world as they are. They move as they need to be seen. Social life is not a reflection of inner truth. It is a marketplace of signals. People learn early which expressions are rewarded, which emotions are tolerated, which behaviors are punished. Over time, these adjustments harden into identity. What you call someone's personality is often just a successful strategy, repeated long enough to feel natural. The mistake is assuming that what is stable is what is sincere. Morality functions the same way. Public virtue is rarely evidence of private integrity. It is evidence of social alignment. People adopt moral language not because they live by it, but because it grants safety, belonging, and leverage. Saying the right thing at the right time often matters more than doing the right thing when no one is watching. And because this behavior is normalized, it becomes invisible. You stop noticing how often goodness is performed rather than embodied. This is why betrayal feels surreal. You weren't naive. You were attentive. You observed consistency. You saw kindness repeated. What you didn't see was context. People don't reveal their nature in stable conditions. They reveal it when incentives shift, when pressure rises, when there is something to lose. The surface illusion convinces you that character is fixed. Pain teaches you it is conditional. The same applies to confidence. Loud certainty is mistaken for strength. Calm composure is mistaken for wisdom. But much of what appears solid is compensatory. Confidence often grows not from self-trust, but from fear of exposure. Certainty often exists to silence doubt rather than resolve it. When you understand this, you realize how much of social interaction is defensive architecture. People are not expressing themselves, they are protecting themselves. You were taught to read sincerity through tone, eye contact, emotional warmth. These cues work in safe environments. They collapse under stress. Someone can sound genuine and still act opportunistically. Someone can express empathy and still abandon you when alignment costs too much. The illusion isn't that people lie constantly, it's that truth is subordinate to survival. This is uncomfortable because it dismantles a core belief that behavior reflects values. In reality, behavior reflects incentives filtered through fear. Values are often retroactive explanations. People act first, then justify. They don't betray because they lack principles. They betray because principles don't pay under certain conditions. The pain comes when you realize you are interpreting signals as commitments. You thought consistency meant loyalty. You thought vulnerability meant trustworthiness. You thought shared language meant shared depth. But surface alignment is cheap. It's accessible to anyone willing to mirror, agree, and perform. Depth requires cost. And cost only appears when things go wrong. This misreading doesn't mean you're foolish. It means you were socialized. Society depends on surface trust to function. If everyone constantly assumed performance, cooperation would collapse. So we are trained to accept appearances until we are personally harmed by them. Pain becomes the corrective mechanism. It strips away the fantasy that observation equals understanding. This is why some lessons cannot be taught. They must be experienced. You can be warned about manipulation and still miss it. You can study psychology and still trust the wrong signals. Because until your expectations are violated, the illusion remains intact. Pain doesn't just hurt, it re-educates perception. Once this illusion breaks, you start noticing subtle things you once ignored. Timing, silence, what people do when there's nothing to gain, how they behave when outcomes are uncertain. you realize that the surface was never meant to be read deeply, it was meant to be navigated. And this recognition is irreversible. You don't become cynical, you become precise. You stop confusing fluency with truth, warmth with safety, consistency with loyalty. You understand that the surface exists to keep things moving, not to reveal what lies beneath. What sits beneath the surface is not chaos, it's machinery, quiet, efficient, largely unconscious. People like to believe their actions originate from thought, intention, or values. But most behavior is driven by older systems, ones designed for survival, not honesty. You don't see these systems directly. You feel them only when they override everything else. The first truth pain teaches is that fear is more persuasive than reason. Not fear as panic, but fear as background radiation. The fear of losing status, the fear of abandonment, the fear of being exposed as insufficient. This fear doesn't announce itself. It disguises itself as preference, principle, or logic. Someone withdraws and calls it needing space. Someone dominates and calls it leadership. Someone lies and calls it protecting peace. The engine underneath is the same. Avoid threat at all costs. Another truth reveals itself when you notice how rarely people choose freely. Conditioning runs deeper than desire. Most adults are still obeying rules written before they had language. Approval once meant safety. Disapproval meant danger. Those equations never fully disappear. They simply become abstract. Praise becomes validation. Rejection becomes shame. And entire lives are organized around chasing one and avoiding the other, long after the original threat is gone. Then there is ego, often misunderstood as arrogance but more accurately described as identity defense. The ego's job is not to make you feel good, it is to keep the self-image intact. When reality threatens that image, the ego intervenes by denying, distorting, blaming, or rewriting events. This is why people resist obvious truths. Accepting them would require psychological death, the collapse of who they think they are. Pain forces this confrontation because it removes the ego's ability to negotiate. A darker realization comes when you see how morality bends under pressure. People don't abandon their ethics suddenly. They gradually reinterpret them. Survival instincts don't announce themselves as desperation. They arrive as justification. What once felt unthinkable becomes reasonable when framed as necessity. This is not evil in the dramatic sense. It is adaptation. But understanding this dissolves the fantasy that character alone protects against harm. Another engine reveals itself through repetition. People repeat what feels familiar, not what feels good. Familiar pain is safer than unfamiliar uncertainty. Someone raised around volatility will unconsciously recreate it, even while claiming to want peace. Someone accustomed to neglect will mistrust attention. The mind confuses predictability with safety. Pain becomes a known landscape, and so it is revisited again and again until awareness interrupts the loop, or exhaustion does. Control is another hidden driver, often disguised as care. People seek control not because they crave power, but because unpredictability once hurt them. Managing outcomes feels like protection, but control degrades relationships. It replaces curiosity with expectation. When control fails, it mutates into resentment. Pain exposes this pattern by showing how much effort goes into preventing outcomes that were never fully preventable. Finally, there is the truth about self-deception. People are not primarily dishonest with others. They are dishonest with themselves, not maliciously, but strategically. The mind edits memory, motive, and meaning to preserve coherence. Pain disrupts this editing process. It creates a rupture where contradictions can no longer be smoothed over. You see yourself acting against your stated beliefs. You see others doing the same, and the illusion of conscious authorship collapses. These engines operate whether you acknowledge them or not. Ignoring them doesn't make you virtuous. It makes you predictable. Pain is the interruption that forces visibility. It doesn't moralize, it reveals. And once you see these mechanisms at work, you realize that behavior is less a reflection of who people are, and more a record of what they're trying to avoid. By the time you reach this layer, judgment starts to feel shallow. Not because people are suddenly excused, but because blame stops explaining anything. Adult behavior begins to look less like choice and more like echo. What you see in the present is often a reenactment, not a decision. Patterns don't originate where they appear. They surface where they are triggered. Most people are carrying unfinished emotional business from a time when they had no power. The body remembers what the mind learned to ignore. A child who learned that affection was conditional grows into an adult who performs for closeness. A child who learned that anger was dangerous becomes an adult who disappears at the first sign of conflict. These adaptations once protected them. Now they quietly govern them. Pain is what exposes this continuity. You notice it when reactions feel disproportionate, when a small slight provokes a large withdrawal, when a mild criticism triggers collapse or aggression. The intensity doesn't belong to the present moment. It belongs to an earlier one. But the adult mind rarely recognizes this. It rationalizes, it justifies, it assigns blame outward. Pain disrupts this process by making the cost of repetition impossible to ignore. This is why people repeat relationships that damage them. The psyche seeks resolution, not comfort. It returns to familiar emotional terrain, hoping for a different ending. Each repetition carries the unconscious fantasy that this time, control will be regained. This time, the wound will close properly. But repetition without awareness doesn't heal. It entrenches. Pain accumulates until the pattern becomes visible or unbearable. When you understand this, you stop seeing cruelty as random. You see it as leakage. Hurt that was never metabolized finds expression. Neglect turns into indifference. Humiliation turns into dominance. Abandonment turns into preemptive detachment. None of this requires conscious intent. In fact, the more unconscious it is, the more convincing it feels to the person enacting it. They believe they are responding to the present, unaware they are defending the past. This is also where self-reflection becomes unavoidable. The same mechanisms you observe in others operate in you. The patterns you resent externally often mirror patterns you haven't confronted internally. The people who trigger you are not necessarily villains. They are familiar. They activate something unresolved. Pain forces this recognition because it removes the comfort of distance. You are no longer just an observer. You are implicated. Understanding patterns doesn't mean absolution. It means accuracy. You can recognize a wound without surrendering to it. You can understand a pattern without remaining inside it. But this requires a shift most people resist, moving from moral interpretation to structural understanding. Not who is wrong, but what is repeating. Not why did they do this to me, but why does this keep happening here? Pain accelerates this shift because it strips away narrative defenses. Stories collapse under repetition. Explanations lose credibility when outcomes don't change. Eventually, the mind is forced to look beneath intention and into structure. This is where insight stops being intellectual and becomes visceral. You feel the weight of inevitability. You see how long this has been running, and you realize how little surface change ever mattered. At this depth, compassion becomes impersonal, not warm, not sentimental, clear. You see how few people escape their early conditioning, how many live entire lives inside adaptations that once made sense but now cause harm. This doesn't make the damage acceptable. It makes it predictable, and predictability changes how you engage. The deepest pain often comes from recognizing your own role in sustaining these cycles, not through blame, but through familiarity, through tolerance, through attraction, through avoidance. You see how patterns require participation, not equal participation, but participation nonetheless. And once seen, this knowledge cannot be undone. This is why some lessons arrive only through pain. Because comfort allows repetition. Pain interrupts it. It forces confrontation with the machinery beneath behavior, yours and theirs. And once you see the core, you can no longer pretend you're dealing only with the present. You are dealing with history, reenacted in real time. Pain reframes everything retroactively, not as tragedy, but as instruction. You realize the world was never designed to teach gently. It tests, it pressures, it exploits hesitation, and it repeats the same lesson until resistance collapses. The suffering wasn't random, it was corrective. By now, the title should feel less like a statement and more like a diagnosis. Some lessons in life are only learned through pain because comfort preserves illusion, because explanation is optional, but consequence is not, because the mind resists what threatens identity, and pain bypasses consent. It forces contact with what is real, not what is preferred. The world will break you, Not out of cruelty, but indifference. It breaks expectations. It breaks narratives. It breaks the belief that understanding alone is enough. What survives is not optimism or innocence. What survives is clarity, a colder, sharper awareness of how people operate, how patterns repeat, how incentives rule behavior. This is not bitterness, it is calibration. Ruthlessness in this sense is not violence or dominance, it is precision, the refusal to lie to yourself, the willingness to see without softening, the discipline to stop negotiating with what has already proven itself. Ruthlessness is choosing accuracy over hope when hope keeps you exposed. If this feels unsettling, that's the point. This wasn't meant to reassure you. It was meant to realign you, to replace interpretation with recognition, to leave you less impressed, less surprised, less vulnerable to repetition. Sit with what surfaced. Let it settle without rushing to conclusions. The value isn't in agreement, it's in perception. And once perception shifts, you don't need instructions. The world teaches the rest, whether you're ready or not.